Pesky Punctuation, how to take control of your punctuation problems. This presentation is primarily going to cover semicolons, colons, question marks, and exclamation points, quotation marks, and apostrophes. Commas are dealt with in a separate mini-lecture. Let's start with the semicolon. The number one rule when considering the use of a semicolon is, when in doubt, cut it out. That's right, there's no rule that requires you to use a semicolon. The only rule is the one that causes you to get marked down if you try to use it and use it incorrectly. So if you're not sure how it should be used and you have no way to find out, just don't use a semicolon. Now, having said that, correct usage is simple. You only use a semicolon where you would otherwise use a period. It's a stop sign. You must come to a full stop and then go on to another sentence. If you don't have a complete sentence on either side of a semicolon, therefore, you're using it incorrectly. The difference between a semicolon and a period is that a semicolon shows that the ideas in the two sentences are closely related, as in the first example, I was hungry, I made lunch. Not as in the second example, I was hungry, I bought a new pair of shoes. Semicolons can also be used in what we call a complex series. This is a series in which at least one of the items contains a comma. It could get very confusing if you said, for example, I went fishing with Bob, comma, who is 21, comma, Mary, comma, who is 18, comma, and Fred, comma, who is 30. Therefore, we use a semicolon to separate off the individual items. So as I went fishing with Bob, comma, who is 21, semicolon, Mary, comma, who is 18, semicolon, and Fred, comma, who is 30. Now, the when in doubt, cut it out rule can also come into play here, because there certainly would be other opportunities and other ways in which you could introduce the ages of the three individuals in the sentence. You do not capitalize the first word that follows a semicolon unless, of course, that first word is a proper noun. So if we look at the example at the bottom, Bob was hungry, semicolon, he made lunch. He is not capitalized. All right, let's talk about the colon for a moment. Contrary to popular belief, colons are not automatically used to introduce a series. In fact, most of the time when you use a colon to introduce a series, you are doing it incorrectly. Simply what a colon does is it introduces something to follow. That something could be a single item or it could be a series. The bottom line, though, and this is the important part, is in order to use a colon, you must have a complete sentence before it. If we look at this first example, you will see one of the most common errors with colons in writing. I went fishing with, colon, Ted, Mary, and Bill. Let's just look at what comes before the colon. We have, I went fishing with. That is not a complete sentence, so we cannot use a colon there. In fact, no punctuation is needed at all in this particular case. Just, I went fishing with Ted, Mary, and Bill. Now, let's look at the second example. I went fishing with the following people, Ted, Mary, and Bill. In front of the colon, we have, I went fishing with the following people. That is a complete sentence. It's not a particularly satisfying sentence because it doesn't tell us what we want to know by itself, but that's where the colon comes in. Almost like a transitional device, the colon says, okay, I've promised you something, now here it comes. And then, of course, in this case, what follows is Ted, Mary, and Bill. That is the correct usage and situation for a colon. Capitalization with colons depends on what follows the colon. If what follows the colon is a complete sentence, then you would capitalize the first word, as in the example below. I found the source of the leak, colon, a pipe was broken. Please also note that before the colon we have, I found the source of the leak, which is a complete sentence, and notice that after the colon, a pipe was broken is also a complete sentence. And we might also note that it is a single item and not a series. That's the entirely correct use of a colon, and the word A is capitalized because we have a complete sentence following the colon. Now, if what follows the colon is not a complete sentence, then we do not capitalize the first word, with the exception, of course, of proper nouns. So if we look at this example, at the bottom we see, I found the source of the problem, colon, a broken pipe. Since a broken pipe is not a complete sentence, we do not capitalize the first word. Question marks. The biggest problem with question marks is just simply forgetting to use them. we write a question and then we put a period down because we're in a hurry or we're not thinking or whatever the case may be. We just forget to put a question mark down there. The best way to catch these is to proofread your work out loud, because when you read out loud you get your ear involved, and your ear expects to hear your voice rise at the end of a question or to drop at the end of a statement, and therefore you're very likely going to get to the end of a sentence where you've forgotten the question mark and you're going to find yourself pausing, and you're much more likely to catch the problem. Now, there are two types of questions. There's what we call a direct question and what we call an indirect question. Direct question is just as it sounds. If we look at the example here, what time is it? This is a question. It requires a direct response, and it's the usual and normal situation in which we use question mark. Let's look at an indirect question, however. In this case, I wonder what time it is. This is an interesting and potentially tricky punctuation situation, because while it's a statement and not a question, you're simply wondering what time it is. Whenever somebody says, I wonder what time it is, they're expecting somebody to respond. So even though it's a statement, we use it to elicit a response like we would with a question. So there can be possibility of confusion. But since it is a statement and not a question, it should be followed by a period. Now let's look at quotation marks. We have some fairly consistent rules in American English when it comes to quotation marks, and once you understand how they work, I think they're pretty clear cut. In American English, periods and commas always go inside the quotation marks. We look at the example down below. The first one we see, I'm hungry, comma, then the close quotation mark, Bob remarked, period, and then a new quotation, I'm not going to wait for dinner, period, close quotation mark. Or in the bottom one, I just read Poe's Annabel Lee, period, close quotation mark. You'll notice we have 3 instead of 2 at the end there. That's because Annabel Lee is the title of a poem, and poem titles usually go in quotation marks as well. When you have a title that goes in quotation marks, and that title also contains the title of something else, or you have a quote that goes in quotation marks, and that quote contains a title that goes in quotation marks, either situation, the thing that goes in quotation marks that is contained inside, we use single quotes, which is the apostrophe key. So basically, it's quote, double quote, I just read Poe's, single quote, Annabel Lee, period, single quote, and then the double quote for the entire sentence. So we end up with 3 marks there right next to each other. Now, colons and semicolons always go outside of quotation marks. In the first example, Mary said she was, quote, too tired, unquote, then comes a semicolon, then I think she was making excuses. And in the second example, with a colon, there are 2 reasons I like the poem, Love Is. Notice quotation marks around love is, and then after the last quotation mark, then comes the closed quotation mark, then comes the colon. And then comes the rest of the sentence. Of course, it captures the essence of love, and it does so by using words we would never associate with love. So just remember, colons and semicolons always go outside of the quotation marks. And of course, just to keep things interesting, when we're dealing with question marks and exclamation points, we have to look very closely at the quoted material, because the location of question marks and exclamation points depends on where the question is located, or the exclamation. In this, if the quoted material inside, or I'm sorry, if the quoted material is a question, then the question mark goes inside. As in the example we see here, where is the restroom? The question is contained within the quotation marks, therefore the question mark goes inside the quotation marks. If we look at the next example, however, who said it's hot in here, and we look and focus just on what's inside the quotation marks, we have it's hot in here. Well, that's not a question, it's a statement. Therefore, the question is the larger sentence that contains the quote, and the question mark therefore goes outside of the quotation marks. And that same rule applies to exclamation points. Apostrophes. Apostrophes are used in contractions or to show possession. Example of possession, the boy's toy is on the floor. Example of a contraction, I won't have time for lunch. Apostrophes are never used to indicate plurality, as in the example at the bottom of the page, 6 cars are parked in the lot. This is not a contraction, and there's nothing that belongs to cars in this sentence. It's just that we have more than one car, so it's plural. No apostrophe is ever used for plurals. All right, let's take a look at possessives. The placement of apostrophes can be confusing with possessives unless you follow this simple rule. And this will work for you every time, but you have to do it the same way, and you have to say your answer out loud. What you simply do is ask who or what belongs to the word in question. If you hear an S at the end of your answer, then it's going to be S apostrophe. If you do not hear an S at the end of your answer, then it's going to be apostrophe S. Let's look at some examples. Okay, this is a singular possessive situation in our example with one dog. And by the way, in case you're wondering how you would know, well, the context of the sentence that you were writing and the subject or the sentence you're reading would tell you that it was singular or plural. You'd be able to tell. All right, so this is singular possessive. The dog's food dish is empty. So let's ask the question, who or what does it belong to? Who does the dish belong to? We have to say the answer out loud. The dish belongs to the dog. Since we do not hear S at the end of our answer, we just hear dog, then it's apostrophe S. The apostrophe must go before the S. So it's the dog's food dish is empty. Dogs is apostrophe S. Now let's look at the next example. This is plural possessive, so we're talking about more than one girl. The girl's room is messy. So let's ask the question, who does the room belong to? Our answer, again, it must be said out loud. The room belongs to the girls. Since we hear an S at the end of the answer, girls, the apostrophe goes after the S. The girl's room is messy, and as you can see, the apostrophe is placed after the S. Here's an example where if you just simply went S apostrophe because it's a plural, you would be incorrect. The women's room is down the hall. If you saw women's like that and knew it was a plural possessive, you would, in many situations, the way we're taught, you would want to go S apostrophe. But if we ask those questions, the question, as I said, and do it out loud, you'll find a different answer. Who does the room belong to? The room belongs to the women. See, we do not hear S at the end of our answer. The room belongs to the women. Therefore, the correct form is apostrophe S. Remember, if you don't hear an S at the end of your answer, then you want apostrophe S. And so the correct form, as we see at the bottom of the page, the women's room is down the hall. It's apostrophe S. Contractions are used to show where letters have been left out of a word. So we have don't for do not, won't for will not, didn't for did not. Your spell checker should flag any contractions you have that are missing an apostrophe. So that should help you out a lot in that particular case. Now, one situation where things can get a little confusing is when we use an apostrophe with the word it's. It's an easy problem to solve, however, if you just try one thing, and that is to substitute the words it is for the word it's in a sentence. If you can substitute the words it is and the sentence still makes sense, then you want the apostrophe. If you substitute it is for it's in a sentence and it doesn't make any sense, then you do not want the apostrophe. Okay? The simple rule is the contraction is the one that gets the apostrophe, not the possessive. So let's look at our example here. The dog knocked over its dish. So let's substitute the words it is for it's in the sentence and see what we get. The dog knocked over it is dish. That doesn't make a bit of sense. Therefore, no apostrophe is needed because that's simply the possessive form. Let's look at the next example. It's cold outside today. Now let's substitute the words it is for it's, and we end up with it is cold outside today. Well, that makes sense. So therefore, it is the contraction form, and it does require the apostrophe. So it's cold outside today, notice, with the apostrophe S.